welcome back to Guilty Until Proven Innocent. This episode is on two things that we often think of as pretty solid in our criminal justice system, and that is DNA evidence and verbal confessions. Now, today we're going to zoom into those two things, DNA and confessions, and to do that, we're going to pull in a documentary called The Confession Tapes. This documentary details the conviction of Sebastian Burns and Atif Rafay. Both of these boys were teenagers when they were sentenced to life in prison based on a false confession that used manipulative police tactics. Then we'll briefly talk about the junk science side of forensic evidence. As you listen along, consider the question, how might a jury's understanding of confessions and forensic evidence hurt innocent people? I'm your host, Arizona, and this is Guilty Until Proven Innocent. On July 13th, 1994, the parents and sister of Atif Rafay were killed in their Bellevue, Washington home. Atif's mother was found with a hijab over her head facing east, which was a sign of Islamic terrorist murder. The boys also had a strong alibi, but despite key factors that pointed away from them as suspects, in 2004, Atif Rafay and his best friend, Sebastian Burns, were both convicted for the murder of Atif's family members. You may be asking yourself, but there was evidence that they weren't the killers. How could the boys have been convicted? Well, the answer is a confession. The Canadian police had obtained a false confession by using a tactic called the Mr. Big technique. This was not the only time that this technique was used. And essentially, the technique consisted of having an undercover cop build a relationship with either the suspect or the suspects, while that undercover cop posed as an authority figure of some sort, typically in a more dangerous setting, such as a gang leader or a mobster. Once that undercover cop got a little closer with the suspects, the cop told them that they must confess to some sort of violent crime in order to enter the group. But even if jurors know this technique, confessions still remain a very powerful part of our court of law. So, if they can be so manipulative, why are confessions such a common crime myth? Because sure, some confessions are lawful and accurate, but many are also police-induced or coerced. There are two main reasons jurors often see confessions as pretty rock-solid evidence to put someone away. Now, the first reason is that the jurors are sort of operating under this belief that they would never admit to a crime that they didn't commit, so why would someone else? And the second assumption that they're operating under is if the confessions contain specific details about how the crime was committed, then it must be the people who did the crime that know these details, right? But the reality is, they aren't in the shoes of those suspects, and they don't know what those confession tactics may have looked like. They don't know whether they would have admitted to something that they didn't do. They also don't know if the details are just there to sound compelling. So by default, juries often assume that those who confess are guilty. The Confession Tapes documentary on Sebastian and Atif challenges this stereotype that the confessions given in a court of law are always true, accurate, or lawful. It dives a little bit into that manipulative technique that we talked about earlier, that Mr. Big technique. We even now know that some of these techniques, such as the Mr. Big technique, works on younger and less wealthy populations, which puts a target on their back based on discrimination of their age and their class. And this ends up taking out other suspects that may be more powerful or wealthy. Let's talk a little bit about DNA evidence and media framing. Let's shift gears. Another way that juries can misinterpret evidence during a trial is by the introduction of forensic evidence. So there's a term that experts have coined as the CSI effect. What that means is that a lot of jurors who consume true crime media will acquit someone or let them go just based on the fact that there's no forensic evidence in a trial. And this happens even when there's no reason to have forensic evidence. So, for example, you're going to have forensic evidence in like a rape or some brutal murder cases, but you most likely will not have forensic evidence in something like a money laundering scheme or a white-collar crime or an armed robbery. But people still expect forensic evidence because of the media that they consume. But there's another side of this, and it's called the reverse CSI effect. Some people argue that the reverse CSI effect is actually even more dangerous to our justice system than the CSI effect on its own. So the reverse CSI effect, it comes from consuming true crime media as well, but it means that when forensic evidence is introduced, there's way too much weight placed on its reliability and its accuracy. There's a lot of things that impact the accuracy of forensic science. In fact, the National Institute of Justice created a typology scale of 5 different categories of errors that can occur in the collection, processing, or the presenting of forensic evidence. These errors range from type 1, which is data reporting errors, such as like someone misinterpreting something, saying something in a way that may be a misrepresentation of the evidence, and the types go all the way up to type 5. Type 5 is an error in how the evidence was handled at the scene or any evidence that went unreported. In one examination by the National Institute of Justice, 891 of 1,391 forensic investigations had at least one error. That is well over 50%. The manipulation sometimes of prosecutors is really powerful. It's also really crucial to understand that a lot of CSI teams are typically not unbiased since they work really closely with prosecutors directly, and they actually benefit from the presentation of really important or corroborating evidence. Truly helpful DNA only comes from very specific cases, but this is not how it's presented. So it's no surprise that all of the crime media we consume shifts our opinions on the justice system. And since many of our trials are jury trials, personal opinions can literally determine whether someone is put behind bars or walks free, or maybe somewhere in between. The confession tapes, that alone could shift public opinion to be more cautious of confessions and to understand sometimes the manipulative or coercive techniques that go behind them. Another example, this very podcast could shift your opinion on the validity of forensic evidence. But it's very important, no matter what media you're consuming, to understand the vital impact of that media. In some cases, public opinion can literally become policy. One example of this, in 2013, the state of Texas passed their so-called junk science law, is what they coined it. And that law had the goal of fighting wrongful convictions based on faulty forensic evidence and overinflated expert testimony. So essentially, it targeted forensic evidence that was done incorrectly or presented incorrectly by an expert. But unfortunately, even within this policy, the Death Penalty Information Center has found that this policy, this law, has actually still failed to help many wrongfully convicted people who really need it. It's really hard to overturn these convictions, and it's really hard to reopen cases once people have been sentenced. For me, coming into watching this documentary and coming into my current semester in college, my opinion on forensic evidence and confessions were radically different than they are now. I've learned so much about how some so-called evidence isn't all that. And when it's presented in a court in a very particular way, or even if it's presented at all, we've seen evidence that it can ruin an innocent person's entire life. Worst case scenario, it can put them in a situation where they're facing the death penalty. In theory, the United States justice system relies on us as citizens and as Americans. I've learned that the responsibility lands on each and every one of us to stay informed, educate ourselves, and to always put things in perspective. When I watched the confession tapes episode, It did a really great job of telling Sebastian and Atif's story in its entirety, and it shifted my perspective of the way that people with less powerful backgrounds can be manipulated and coerced by law enforcement. I remember there was a really powerful moment in the film where the documentary essentially said that the defense counsel's motions to exclude the confessions were entirely denied, and that jurors, as soon as they saw the confession, their mind was made up. Nothing could be done from there. I think about myself and how maybe I could be that juror, or maybe I could be that suspect. Either way, if the system is built on individuals like me and you, we have the job to inform and educate ourselves. So let's re-ask that question from the beginning again. How might a jury's understanding of confessions and forensic evidence end up hurting innocent people? The answer is that our understanding can be overflated. It can be inaccurate. It can be misinformed. Sometimes it can even be careless. But ultimately, normal people's understandings are the things that put innocent people behind bars all the time. The change needs to come from our education of ourselves. The change needs to come from empathy, knowing, again, you could be in the shoes of the suspect that you're seeing in a courtroom or that you watch on TV. And the change comes from wanting to understand, from making sure that our mindset is innocent until proven guilty, not the other way around. I'm your host, Arizona, and thank you for listening to Guilty Until Proven Innocent.